They came from somewhere beyond this world, ruled this planet for hundreds of thousands of years, and then, according to the most ancient written records humanity has ever produced, they left. Or they tried to, because buried inside clay tablets that survived 4,000 years of wars, empires, floods, and fires, there is a detail so strange, so quietly devastating, that most scholars gloss over it entirely. The Sumerian texts don't just describe the Anunnaki arriving on Earth. They describe the Anunnaki trying desperately to go back and failing. Something stopped them. Something kept them here. And the more you read between the cuneiform lines, the more a terrifying question begins to take shape. What if the beings who created humanity were just as trapped on this planet as we are? What if the gods weren't ruling from above, but were stranded below, managing a prison they had built for themselves? If you're ready to follow one of the oldest mysteries in recorded human history, all the way to the edge of what we think we know, you're in exactly the right place, and you'll want to stay until the very end. Let's begin. Picture a museum storage room in London. Long fluorescent lights, the smell of dust and old stone. Row after row of shelves crowded with clay fragments no bigger than a hand. Some of these objects have been sitting in this building since the mid-1800s, cataloged, labeled, and largely forgotten by the general public. But inside the British Museum right now, there are more than 130,000 cuneiform tablets, the largest collection of Sumerian and Babylonian written records anywhere on Earth. Some of these tablets are over 5,000 years old. And some of them, according to researchers who have spent decades studying the original language rather than official translations, contain passages that have never been fully and openly discussed in mainstream archaeology. Not because they're damaged, not because they're illegible, but because what they say, taken literally, doesn't fit the story we've been told about the dawn of civilization. The Sumerian civilization itself is undeniably real. It emerged in the region known as Mesopotamia, modern-day southern Iraq, somewhere around 4,500 BCE, making it one of the earliest complex societies ever identified. Thus, the Sumerians gave humanity some of its first written language, its first recorded legal codes, and its first sophisticated astronomical observations. These are not myths or legends. These are archaeological facts confirmed by over a century of excavation and academic study. The city of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever built, has been dated by archaeologists to approximately 5,500 BCE. The ziggurat ruins that still rise from the Iraqi desert today are not metaphors. They are stone and mortar, measurable and real. And yet, inside the texts produced by the people who built those ziggurats, there is a story, a cosmology, a history, a memory that academic institutions have never fully reconciled with what they claim to understand about human origins. That gap, that silence, here is exactly where this story lives. Here's where it gets strange. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented civilization. They claimed it was given to them. Their texts, the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis, the King List, describe in explicit detail a group of beings they called the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens, established the first cities, taught humans agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, and astronomy, and ruled over early humanity as gods. Now, mainstream scholars have long interpreted these beings as mythological, divine archetypes, like the gods of Greece or Rome. But some researchers point to something deeply unusual in the Sumerian approach. Unlike the mythologies of almost every other ancient culture, that the Sumerians consistently describe their gods with a precision that sounds less like religious poetry and more like eyewitness documentation. Specific heights, specific tools, specific vehicles that flew, specific methods of communication over long distances, specific conflicts over resources, specific political decisions. Could it be that the Sumerians were not writing mythology at all? Could it be that they were writing history, and that we, 4,000 years later, simply lack the framework to recognize it? The word itself carries weight the moment you examine it closely. The term Anunnaki is most commonly translated from ancient Sumerian as those who from heaven came to earth, though some scholars prefer the translation royal blood or princely seed. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's foremost authorities on Sumerian language, who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania translating original tablets, documented over 3,000 lines of Sumerian literary text referencing the Anunnaki as physical, active beings with distinct personalities, rivalries, and physical needs, including the need to eat, sleep, and apparently, the need to breathe. Not spiritual metaphors, not symbolic representations of natural forces. Beings described as eating bread and drinking water. Beings described as becoming tired. Beings who, in one particularly striking passage of the Atrahasis epic, are described as going on strike, refusing to continue their labor, because the work was too difficult and their bodies were wearing out. What if we took that description seriously? Plus, what if the gods of Sumer were not omnipotent beings above human suffering, but physical creatures operating inside the same biological constraints as the humans they created? This is the first thread to pull. Because everything that follows, every mystery, every contradiction, every terrifying implication of these ancient texts, traces back to one core idea. The Anunnaki were physical. They had bodies. They experienced fatigue, disease, aging, and yes, according to certain texts, death. And if they were physical, then they were subject to the laws of physics, including the one law that may have ultimately sealed their fate on this planet. The law that says you cannot go home if home is no longer where you left it. And now here is something the mainstream conversation almost never addresses. The specific timeline the Sumerian texts actually propose. The ancient Sumerian king list, a document discovered at the beginning of the 20th century and now housed partly in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, lists the reigns of pre-flood kings stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. 8 kings are listed before the Great Flood, with reigns lasting anywhere from 18,000 to 36,000 years each. Mainstream scholars dismiss these figures as symbolic or exaggerated, and they may well be. But what if those numbers aren't meant to represent human years? What if they represent something else entirely? A different measurement of time, perhaps tied to the orbital cycle of wherever the Anunnaki came from. There are those who say that if you convert those enormous reign lengths using specific astronomical cycles tied to the precession of the equinoxes, the numbers begin to align with real, measurable celestial events. That's a claim that deserves scrutiny. But it's also a claim that has never been thoroughly debunked, because it has barely been thoroughly investigated. The celestial object that keeps appearing at the center of this mystery is the one the Babylonians called Nibiru, a name that appears in multiple astronomical texts, and has been the subject of fierce debate for decades. In classical Babylonian astronomy, Nibiru was used as a name for a specific celestial position, often associated with Jupiter, or occasionally with a crossing point in the sky. But in the works of Zecharia Sitchin, the Russian-born, British-educated researcher who spent decades studying Sumerian texts before publishing The 12th Planet in 1976, Nibiru was something far more specific and far more troubling. A large planet in an elongated, elliptical orbit that brought it close to Earth roughly every 3,600 years. Sitchin argued, based on his reading of the original Sumerian tablets rather than conventional translations, that the Anunnaki came from this planet, and that they arrived on Earth during one of Nibiru's close approaches. His translation work remains controversial, vigorously challenged by mainstream Assyriologists who argue that his linguistic interpretations were idiosyncratic at best and manipulative at worst. But consider this. He was not working from blank imagination. He was working from the same tablets that sit in the British Museum, the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad, and the Oriental Institute in Chicago. The same clay, the same cuneiform, different reading. And that difference in reading is where the mystery breathes. Because if Nibiru exists, if it is a real body in an elongated orbit, then here is the problem. An orbit that takes 3,600 years to complete means Nibiru is only near Earth for a brief window every 3.5 millennia. Miss that window, and you wait 3,600 years for the next one. Now imagine you are an Anunnaki expedition member who arrived on Earth during a close approach, with a mission to mine gold and return when Nibiru swings back. And then imagine that something goes wrong. The mission takes longer than planned. Now there is a rebellion among the lower caste workers, the Igigi, as the Sumerian texts call them. There is a catastrophic flood. There is civil war between your own commanders, Enki and Enlil, whose conflict is documented across dozens of separate tablets in precise, almost bureaucratic detail. The window closes. Nibiru moves on without you, and the next approach is 3,600 years away. What do you do? What can you do? You are stranded. You are trapped on a planet that is not yours. And you have created, either by design or accident, an entire species of intelligent beings, the humans, who now require management, who now worship you as gods, who now depend on you, and who you increasingly depend on in return. Is it possible that this is not a myth about divine punishment, but a factual account of a stranding? Is it possible that the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was never one of gods and servants, but of castaways and the civilization they built to survive? Here is where the texts themselves become something extraordinary, because they don't just hint at a stranding. They describe in several passages a specific and growing desperation among the Anunnaki leadership. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives in human history with versions dating back to at least 1700 BCE, describes the Anunnaki gods holding council after the flood and genuinely uncertain about what to do next. Their leader Enlil is described as furious, not triumphant and divine, but genuinely, humanly angry in the way of someone whose plans have collapsed. He ordered the flood, according to the text, specifically because the noise of humanity had become unbearable. But some researchers suggest a secondary reading of that passage that has never fully entered public discourse. What if the noise described wasn't literal sound at all? What if it was a Sumerian metaphor for overpopulation, for the rapid multiplication of the humans the Anunnaki had created? A multiplication that was now consuming resources the Anunnaki themselves needed? What if the flood was not divine punishment, but a calculated resource management decision made by beings who were running out of options on a planet they never planned to stay on indefinitely? And then, most chillingly, what if it didn't work? Picture Enlil in the aftermath. The waters receding across Mesopotamia, the plains of ancient Iraq thick with mud and rotting vegetation, at the survivors gathering at the high ground where the Anunnaki keep their command centers. Enlil looks out at the rebuilt human population, alive, multiplying again, already climbing toward the same numbers that prompted the catastrophe in the first place. And he knows, in whatever way, a physical being with a lifespan that dwarfs human comprehension can know something. This is permanent. There is no return. The flood did not solve the resource problem. The humans are too resilient, too productive, too impossible to fully contain. And Nibiru is already drawing away, already receding into the darkness between stars, already beginning its next 3,600-year arc into the outer reaches of the solar system. The moment of departure has passed. The Anunnaki are still here. The question is no longer when they go home. The question is what they do with a forever they didn't choose. And then something changed, in the texts themselves. Because in the later Sumerian records, beginning roughly with the period after the flood narrative, the Anunnaki begin to withdraw. Not all at once, not dramatically. But the presence of the gods in the stories begins to fade. The first cities, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, are described as being handed off to human kings. The concept of kingship, according to the Sumerian king list, was literally lowered from heaven, a phrase scholars have long read as metaphorical, but which, viewed through a different lens, sounds remarkably like a handover of authority from beings who are stepping back from direct governance. What if the withdrawal wasn't transcendence? What if it was concealment? What if the Anunnaki, realizing they could not leave, chose instead to disappear from view, to relocate, to go underground in some sense, to manage their permanent exile in a way that didn't require them to be visible to the civilization they had created? There are those who argue that the ancient tradition of gods going to the underworld, which appears not only in Sumerian texts, but in Egyptian, Greek, Mesoamerican, and Hindu mythology, might be a preserved memory of exactly this kind of physical concealment. Not metaphysical death and rebirth, but literal relocation below ground. Literally underground. Now here is a detail that the standard telling almost always skips over, and it is, arguably, the most important biological clue in the entire Anunnaki mystery. Plus multiple Sumerian texts, including sections of the Atrahasis epic and the creation of man narrative attributed to the god Enki, describe the process by which humans were created. The Anunnaki, specifically Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, used their own genetic material, their own divine essence, translated by Sitchin and others as actual biological material, to modify existing hominids into a new species capable of labor. Mainstream scholars read this as mythology about divine breath of life, spiritual essence breathed into clay. But consider the literal reading. If the Anunnaki introduced their own biological material into the human genome to create a capable worker species, what would that mean for their own biology over subsequent generations? Could it be that after centuries or millennia on Earth, eating Earth's food, us breathing Earth's air, reproducing in some cases with humans according to texts that describe hybrid offspring, the Anunnaki themselves underwent irreversible biological changes? What if their bodies adapted to Earth in ways that made them unable to survive the journey home, even if Nibiru came close enough to attempt it? What if they had, quite literally, become too earthly to leave? This is the biological trap theory, and it is perhaps the most haunting of all the explanations buried inside the Sumerian record, because it implies not a dramatic cosmic punishment, not a mechanical failure of ships or technology, but a slow, invisible, cellular transformation. The kind of change you don't notice until the moment you realize it is irreversible. Yet some researchers who have studied the texts alongside modern genetic science point to something genuinely strange in the human genome. The presence of a small but significant cluster of genetic sequences that have no clear evolutionary precursor. Sequences that appear, in the words of some geneticists, inserted rather than evolved. These researchers are not all fringe theorists. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA and a Nobel Prize laureate, proposed in 1973 a theory called directed panspermia, the idea that life on Earth was deliberately seeded by an extraterrestrial civilization. He wasn't talking about the Anunnaki by name, but the framework he proposed: sophisticated genetic engineering, deliberate transplantation of biological material across space, maps with uncomfortable precision, onto what the Sumerian texts described thousands of years earlier. Is it possible that what the Sumerians recorded as divine creation was, in fact, a genetic engineering project? And if so, is it possible that the engineers became as changed by the experiment as the subjects? The Igigi rebellion is a piece of the puzzle that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. In the pre-flood Sumerian texts, there are two tiers of Anunnaki described. The upper tier, the senior gods, the decision-makers, are the Anunnaki proper: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. Below them is a second class called the Igigi, sometimes called the Anunnaki's assistants or laborers, beings who did the actual physical work of mining and construction on Earth's surface, while the senior Anunnaki apparently operated from higher altitudes or orbital positions. The Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi going on strike, a full labor rebellion, after 40 cycles of exhausting work with no end in sight. And here is where the texts offer something extraordinary. It was specifically because of this rebellion that the decision was made to create humans. The Igigi refused to continue working. The Anunnaki needed laborers. Enki proposed creating a hybrid worker species to replace the striking Igigi. Humans were, according to this reading, a management solution to a labor dispute. But what did the Igigi do after humans were created? The texts say they were relieved of labor, but they don't clearly say what happened to them next. There are passages, fragmented, partially damaged, that suggest some of the Igigi chose to come to Earth permanently. Some took human women as partners, that some integrated with human communities so thoroughly that they became indistinguishable from the human population they had helped to supervise. What if the Igigi never even attempted to return to Nibiru? What if some of them became the first hybrid bloodlines, half extraterrestrial, half human, whose descendants still exist today, carrying genetic traces of the original engineers? Consider this. The royal bloodlines of ancient Sumer explicitly claim descent from the gods, not symbolically, literally. The kings of Uruk, and Akkad describe themselves as children of the Anunnaki. What if they weren't speaking metaphorically? And then we arrive at the Great Flood, and a revelation buried inside the flood narrative that changes everything else. The conventional reading of the Anunnaki flood story is straightforward enough. Enlil decided to destroy humanity. Enki secretly warned a human named Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh version, or Noah in the biblical derivative. And a select group survived the deluge. The flood is dismissed by mainstream science as either mythology or a reference to a real but regional flood event in Mesopotamia. But here is what the official narrative glosses over with extraordinary speed. The Sumerian texts describe the flood not as a decision made calmly and methodically, but as a response to an approaching astronomical event. There are passages, particularly in certain damaged tablets recovered from Nippur and now housed in multiple institutions, that appear to describe a massive object approaching Earth from deep space, creating tidal disruptions and atmospheric changes. This object is associated, in context, with Nibiru. What if the flood wasn't caused by a deity's decision at all? What if Nibiru's close approach, its gravitational influence on Earth's tidal systems, was the actual physical cause of the flood? And what if the Anunnaki knew it was coming because they had observed the approach from their monitoring stations? Because they had seen this happen before, on other approaches in earlier cycles. And they knew that the only way to survive was to retreat to their orbital platforms and wait for the worst to pass. Picture it. The Anunnaki command center somewhere in what is now southern Iraq. The sky going a color no one born on Earth has ever seen before. The gravity tides pulling at the Persian Gulf until the shoreline retreats and then surges back in walls of brown water. The senior Anunnaki are above all of it, watching from orbit, watching the humans they created scatter and drown below. And now, imagine what they see next. As the waters recede, as Nibiru completes its closest pass and begins to arc away into the deep solar system, they realize, with a weight that has no good word in either Sumerian or English, that this was their moment. This was the window. Nibiru was close enough for departure. Their ships were functional. The return was possible, physically, mechanically, gravitationally possible, for the first time in thousands of years. And they didn't take it, or couldn't. Or something happened in those orbital hours that made departure impossible despite proximity. But the texts don't explain why. They describe the aftermath. The gods descending back to Earth, resuming their positions, re-establishing governance. But they never explain the decision not to leave. That silence is not an absence of information. It is the loudest thing in the entire archive. There are researchers who believe that the answer to this silence lies in a body of Sumerian tablets that the world has never fully seen. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, an ancient Assyrian king who reigned in the 7th century BCE and who is known to have obsessively collected and copied the oldest Sumerian texts he could find. Originally contained an estimated 30,000 clay tablets in the ancient city of Nineveh. When Austin Henry Layard excavated the site between 1845 and 1851, he recovered a substantial portion of those tablets, now housed in the British Museum. But ancient accounts suggest that Ashurbanipal's collection was larger, significantly larger, than what was recovered. Layard himself noted in his excavation journals that he found evidence of additional storage chambers that had been deliberately sealed, and that these chambers appeared to have been emptied, not destroyed, but emptied, at some point before the city's fall. Where did those tablets go? Who removed them? And what was important enough about their content to warrant deliberate preservation in the middle of a collapsing empire? There are those who say that a subset of the most sensitive Sumerian texts, the ones describing the Anunnaki's internal deliberations, their departure attempts, now their communications with whatever authority existed on Nibiru, were selectively removed from Ashurbanipal's library before the Assyrian Empire's collapse and quietly absorbed into private collections. Some researchers point to the Vatican archives, which houses documents dating back to the 8th century CE, and which is known to contain materials obtained from ancient Near Eastern excavations in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Vatican has never published a full catalog of its holdings from this period. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a fact. What's inside remains largely unknown. Here is where the modern layer of this story becomes deeply uncomfortable. In 2003, in the weeks following the United States invasion of Iraq, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. The world watched in real time as thousands of artifacts, many of them Sumerian, disappeared from the museum's collections. American military commanders were widely criticized for failing to protect the museum, despite having detailed maps of its location and explicit pre-war warnings from archaeologists and UNESCO officials that it needed to be secured. Some looted artifacts have been recovered over the years. Many have not. Among the missing items were cuneiform tablets from the Nippur collection. Tablets that, according to several Assyriologists who had studied them before the looting, contained passages from the Atrahasis cycle that had never been fully published in academic literature. Could it be that the looting was not opportunistic chaos, but targeted? Could it be that someone, in the confusion of a war, knew exactly which tablets to take and why? There are those in the archaeological community who noted, quietly and carefully, that the cases broken into most thoroughly were not the ones containing gold artifacts, which would have made the most obvious targets for opportunistic thieves. The most thoroughly ransacked sections contained clay tablets, plain clay tablets, with no monetary value on any conventional black market. What if someone wanted those particular texts? And what if the reason they wanted them was connected to whatever information has always been kept just out of public reach? The question of what the Anunnaki ultimately became, those who remained stranded, those who could not leave, is the deepest layer of this mystery. And it is one the Sumerian texts approach with a kind of narrative hesitation, as if even the ancient scribes understood that what they were recording was dangerous. The later texts, the ones produced in the period of the Third Dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, describe the Anunnaki increasingly as distant presences, not gone, but unreachable, not dead, but withdrawn. Prayers are still addressed to them, temples are still built in their honor, kings still claim divine lineage. But the direct interaction, the face-to-face governance of early texts, has been replaced by something more institutional. Religious hierarchy, priestly intermediaries, ritual systems that seem designed to create the impression of divine contact while obscuring the actual nature of whatever relationship still existed. Is it possible that this institutionalization of religion, the replacement of direct divine contact with organized priestly ritual, was not a natural spiritual evolution, but a deliberate design? What if the Anunnaki, having accepted their permanent exile, chose to recede behind the screen of organized religion, to maintain influence over the human civilization they had created, without being directly visible to it? What if every major religious institution on Earth carries, in its most protected inner architecture, a structural blueprint designed not by human spirituality, but by beings who needed to maintain contact with humanity from a distance? And there's a thread here that runs much further forward in time than most discussions acknowledge. Because the Anunnaki mystery doesn't end with Sumer. It doesn't end with Babylon. The same figures, by different names, with slightly different attributes, but with identical structural roles, appear in the records of ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient Mesoamerica, and ancient China. The Sumerian Enki becomes the Egyptian Ptah, the creator god who fashions humans on a potter's wheel. The Sumerian Enlil becomes the Egyptian Amun, the hidden one, the concealed god. The Igigi, those second-tier beings who came to Earth and integrated with humanity. Their descendants, some researchers argue, appear in the Vedic rishis, the Mesopotamian Apkallu sages, the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim of Genesis. Across every major ancient civilization, there is a preserved memory of beings who came from somewhere else, who taught humanity everything it knows, but who then either departed or withdrew, and whose departure or withdrawal was incomplete, unresolved, haunted. What if that global parallel tradition isn't coincidence? What if it's memory? What if, scattered across the oldest religious and mythological texts of every culture on Earth, there are fragments of the same original story? The story of beings stranded on a world that wasn't theirs, managing an exile they never chose, leaving echoes in human consciousness that have never fully faded. The Geology tells a story too, one that sits quietly beneath all the textual speculation and asks to be taken seriously on its own terms. The Younger Dryas event, a catastrophic climate disruption that occurred roughly 12,900 years ago and which ended the last ice age with terrifying abruptness, remains one of the most poorly explained events in Earth's geological history. In a span of geological time that amounts to barely a blink, global temperatures dropped sharply, megafauna across North America and Europe went extinct, and entire coastal civilizations, if any existed, would have been wiped from the landscape by the resulting sea level changes. Some scientists attribute the Younger Dryas to a massive comet or asteroid impact. Others point to volcanic activity. A few, working at the fringes of acceptable academic discourse, have raised the possibility of a gravitational disruption caused by a large astronomical body passing close to Earth. What if the Younger Dryas event and the Sumerian flood memory describe the same catastrophe? What if the approach of Nibiru, whatever Nibiru actually is, caused not just a flood in Mesopotamia, but a global catastrophic reset of life on Earth? And what if the Anunnaki, who the texts say were already present on Earth before this event, experienced it not as outsiders observing from orbit, but as survivors, as beings who were caught on the ground when the window closed and who watched from whatever shelter they could find as the world they had planned to leave was remade around them? Consider this. Every culture that has a flood story, and nearly every culture on Earth has one, also has a tradition of what happened immediately after the flood. Not chaos, not rebuilding from scratch, re-civilization. The gods descend again, and the knowledge returns. The cities are re-established with remarkable speed. The Sumerian king list notes explicitly that after the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven again. The Egyptian records describe the gods of the first time, the Zep Tepi, returning to guide the rebuilding of civilization after a great catastrophe. The Vedic texts describe the gods returning after the Pralaya, the cosmic dissolution, to re-establish dharmic order. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl tradition describes a feathered serpent deity who arrives after a great destruction and reteaches civilization to the survivors. Is it possible that what all of these traditions remember is not multiple independent mythological cycles, but a single real event, witnessed by multiple populations across the globe, in which the Anunnaki, stranded, is unable to depart during Nibiru's close approach, battered by the geological chaos that approach caused, emerged from their shelters and began again? Not as gods returning from heaven, but as refugees rebuilding on Earth? The question of whether any Anunnaki survive today, in whatever form, in whatever state of transformation thousands of years of Earth habitation would produce, is one that serious researchers approach with extreme care, because the territory between legitimate inquiry and conspiracy theory is, in this area, dangerously narrow. But there are fragments of evidence worth noting with precision. In 1976, researchers working in the region of southern Turkey began excavating a site called Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone pillars arranged in elaborate circles, decorated with detailed animal carvings. Buried deliberately under thousands of tons of fill material at a date now confirmed to be approximately 11,600 years ago. This is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the pyramids of Giza. At the time it was built, according to mainstream archaeology, humans were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers without the cognitive or organizational capacity to construct something of this scale. Göbekli Tepe forces the conclusion that there was a sophisticated organizing intelligence at work in the ancient Near East at least 11,000 years ago, before any civilization is supposed to have existed. What was it? Who built it? And why was it deliberately buried? Some researchers argue it was buried to hide it from a catastrophe, to preserve it for future rediscovery. Now others say it was buried to hide it from something searching for it. What if it wasn't built by humans alone? What if Göbekli Tepe is a marker, a waypoint, a signal, a record of presence, left by beings who knew they were going to go underground and wanted to leave something in the earth that would survive until the next moment of contact. Now here is the truly strange thing. The layout of Göbekli Tepe's main enclosures, when mapped against the night sky, appears to align with specific star clusters. Not the stars visible from that region today, but the stars as they would have appeared roughly 10,800 BCE due to the precession of the equinoxes. The researchers who identified this alignment, working independently from the site's official excavation team, noted that the central pillar of the main enclosure appears to point directly at the star Deneb in the constellation Cygnus, which, at that ancient date, sat at the precise point of the celestial North Pole. This is not a coincidence that builds itself. This is precision astronomy embedded in stone at a date when no one was supposed to understand precision astronomy. Who had that knowledge? And who preserved it in a structure they then deliberately concealed underground, as if they were hiding a message for a future civilization capable of understanding what they had left? And here is where the 4 layers of this mystery collapse into a single, almost unbearable question. Thus, Layer 1 told us what the Sumerian texts officially say: that the Anunnaki came, ruled, created humans, and withdrew. Layer 2 revealed the deeper reading, that their withdrawal was not triumphant ascension, but a stranded exile, that Nibiru's orbital mechanics may have made departure impossible, that their own biology may have changed beyond the point of return. Layer 3 showed us the conspiracy dimensions, the missing tablets, the deliberately emptied libraries, the looted museum, the institutional silence around the most sensitive portions of the ancient record. And now Layer 4 asks the question that synthesizes all 3. If the Anunnaki could not return home, if they are, by some definition, still here, what does that mean for what we call civilization? What does it mean for the institutions that govern us? Give the religions that shape our values? The bloodlines that have held power across millennia, with a continuity that no purely human explanation has ever satisfactorily justified? What if the history we think we know, this neat narrative of primitive hunter-gatherers slowly developing agriculture and writing and architecture through gradual cultural evolution, is a story constructed precisely to conceal a more complicated truth? Not by a shadowy modern conspiracy, but by the ancient, original design of beings who needed humanity to remain manageable? What if we have been, from the very beginning, what the Sumerian texts say we were? A created species administered by our creators, carefully kept from remembering exactly who made us and why. The silence from Nibiru is, in its own way, the most devastating evidence of all. Now, because if the Anunnaki had a homeworld, and if that homeworld was capable of launching expeditions to Earth, and if 3,600 years have now passed since the last recorded divine presence in the ancient Near East, then Nibiru, by the Sumerian timeline, should have come close to Earth again somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, which is, strikingly, exactly the period in which the major monotheistic religions of the modern world emerged: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of them arising within a few centuries of when Nibiru would theoretically have been at its closest approach since the Sumerian period. And as what if those 3,000 years of religious transformation, from polytheistic Anunnaki worship to monotheistic abstraction, represent the desperate administrative restructuring of a stranded civilization that knew its home was close and still could not find a way to reach it? What if the shift from the gods to God, from many physical beings to one invisible absolute, was not a spiritual evolution, but a strategic concealment? The beings are still here. The contact is still managed. But the framework has been redesigned. The intermediaries have been institutionalized, and the original story has been so thoroughly mythologized that even those carrying its memory have forgotten what it actually describes? So where does that leave us? Here is the full shape of the mystery. Just as the Sumerian texts, read not as mythology but as documentation, allow us to see it. Beings arrived on Earth from elsewhere, possibly from a planet in an unusual orbit, possibly during a close approach window that occurs once every several thousand years. They came to extract resources, specifically gold, which appears in the texts as the primary motivation for the expedition. They created humans to assist with the labor. The orbital window closed before the mission was complete, or before departure could be successfully executed, or because something biological or technological made return impossible despite proximity. The flood, whatever caused it, was either Nibiru's doing or was used as cover for a stranding that was already inevitable. The Anunnaki, unable to leave, chose concealment over direct governance. They built institutions, religious, political, dynastic. To manage the human civilization, they remained embedded within. And they left in the most ancient texts of that civilization an incomplete, partially erased, carefully curated record of all of this. A record that we are still, right now, in the 21st century, fighting to fully read. What do we do with that? What do you do with the possibility, not the certainty, but the genuine, document-supported possibility, that the oldest story in the world is not a myth about divine creation, but a record of a stranding? That the gods of Sumer were not transcendent beings who chose to bless humanity with their presence, but physical entities who found themselves unable to leave and made the best of it? There are three explanations that sit, equally plausible, as at the edge of what we can prove. The first, the Anunnaki are pure mythology. The Sumerian texts are religious literature, and all of the extraordinary correspondences between ancient texts and modern physics and genetics are coincidence and pattern-seeking. This is the mainstream position, and it has the weight of institutional authority behind it, though not always the weight of the evidence. The second, the Anunnaki were real physical beings. Their stranding was real, and their descendants, biological, cultural, institutional, remain woven into the fabric of human civilization in ways we have been systematically prevented from recognizing. The third, and perhaps the strangest, the Anunnaki did eventually find a way home, not physically, but through the civilization they created. That humanity itself, with its growing reach into space, its developing understanding of genetics and orbital mechanics and deep time, is the Anunnaki's final vehicle. That we are not their abandoned experiment. We are their return journey. The tablets are still being translated. The sites are still being excavated. The questions are still unanswered. And somewhere beneath the ruins of the oldest cities on Earth, beneath the mud and the millennia and the accumulated weight of everything we think we understand about ourselves, the Cuneiform record keeps its deepest secrets in the patient, unhurried way that only stone can. What do you think really happened? Were they stranded by physics, by biology, by catastrophe, or by something in the nature of Earth itself that no one has yet named? Was the withdrawal of the Anunnaki a tragedy, a strategy, or a transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those questions that every answer only deepens. The mystery of the Anunnaki is not a mystery that ends with a solution. It is the kind of mystery that ends with a mirror. One that reflects not just the ancient past, but the full strangeness of what we are and what we might yet become. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again, stay curious.